We have not inherited an easy world. There are threats now to our freedom, indeed to our very existence, that other generations could never even have imagined. At the same time, there is a threat posed to human freedom by the enormous power of the modern state. History teaches the dangers of government that overreaches, political control taking precedence over free economic growth, secret police, mindless bureaucracy, all combining to stifle individual excellence and personal freedom. We're approaching the end of a bloody century plagued by a terrible political invention, totalitarianism. Optimism comes less easily today, not because democracy is less vigorous, but because democracy's enemies have refined their instruments of repression. Yet optimism is in order, because day by day, democracy is proving itself to be a not at all fragile flower. No, democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating. If the rest of this century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideals, we must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy. Our military strength is a prerequisite to peace, but let it be clear, we maintain this strength in the hope it will never be used. For the ultimate determinant in the struggle is now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas, a trial of spiritual resolve, the values we hold, the beliefs we cherish, the ideals to which we are dedicated. While we must be cautious about forcing the pace of change, we must not hesitate to declare our ultimate objectives and to take concrete actions to move toward them. We must be staunch in our conviction that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Roger Zakheim, Director of the Reagan Institute. Thank you so much for joining us on this very special day, both those here in person at the Institute and the virtual audience joining us online. We really appreciate it. Now, today, we're commemorating the 40th anniversary of one of President Reagan's most historic speeches, his address to the British Parliament at Westminster on June 8th, 1982. That speech was also one of his most impactful, as it led to the creation of America's architecture to advance freedom and promote democracy around the world. Our commemoration coincides with the publication of a new report from the Reagan Institute's Westminster 2.0 Working Group. Everybody in the audience has it right here. Beautiful report. I encourage those online to download it off the Reagan Foundation website. Now, the Westminster Working Group convened current and former public officials, technology experts, freedom and democracy advocates, and business leaders, many of whom are in the room here today. And I'd be remiss at this moment without thanking our co-chairs of this effort, Mr. Ken Wollack and Mr. Mark Green, who led this effort over a 2-year period of time, as well as the Reagan Foundation and Institute staff who worked really hard over this period of time putting this report together. Ms. Rachel Hoff, the policy director of the Reagan Institute, Mr. Thomas Kenna, the policy assistant in the Center for Freedom and Democracy, as well as Dr. Inboden and Ms. Netta Horowitz, all of which really made great contributions to the report. In addition to our co-chairs, our working group members really made invaluable contributions to this effort. As I said, they were charged with developing a Westminster 2.0 approach for the 21st century, 40 years on from the original speech. How how should we modernize and reinvigorate our efforts to promote freedom around the world in the context of today's challenges and opportunities, from rising authoritarianism to emerging technologies? Now, we'll hear later from the co-chairs of the working group and some members during the panel discussion. But first, I want us to consider broader context. The 40th anniversary of President Reagan's Westminster speech comes at a critical time for the United States. In 1982, authoritarianism and communism were on the offensive. There was a growing sense that freedom and democracy were falling behind. Today, there's a similar sentiment. Freedom House reports that in 2021 was the 16th consecutive year of global democratic decline. From the streets of Bucha, Ukraine, to the internment camps in Xinjiang, China, there is a global need for American leadership with democracy and freedom at its core. What is the United States doing about it? There's probably no better person to speak to the current administration's approach to these issues than our guest today, Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, Uzra Zeya. Undersecretary Zeya has a distinguished career serving our nation in the U.S. Foreign Service for 27 years. She served around the world, from Syria to Egypt to India to France, in addition to her time in policy roles at the State Department headquarters in Washington. In her capacity as Undersecretary, she leads the State Department's efforts around the world to help build more secure, democratic, and free societies. In many ways, her work embodies the mission that President Reagan laid out 40 years ago. And that is why we're so grateful to have the Undersecretary with us today. So please, join me in welcoming Undersecretary of State Uzra Zeya for her remarks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roger, and it's just wonderful to see so many old friends and new ones in the audience today. I'm so honored to be invited by the Reagan Institute here today to celebrate the launch of the working group's report. Congratulations. But also the 40th anniversary of President Reagan's groundbreaking Westminster speech. Little did we know at that moment how soon Soviet communism would follow leg warmers and New Coke into the ash heap of history. More seriously, your report reflects important bipartisan consensus on challenges to freedom and democratic governance across the world and where we need to focus going forward. So I'm thrilled to share with you my views on this timely topic and what the Biden administration is doing with partners like you to renew democracy around the globe. When President Reagan addressed the British Parliament at Westminster in 1982, he said, and I quote, "Optimism comes less easily today, not because democracy is less vigorous, but because democracy's enemies have refined their instruments of repression. Yet optimism is in order, because day by day, democracy is proving itself to be a not at all fragile flower," unquote. What's striking to me 4 decades later is how compelling President Reagan's call for optimism and multi-stakeholder action in defense of democracy remains in today's disrupted world. Yes, 4 decades later, authoritarian regimes have refined tools to suppress their own citizens, stifle independent media and civil society, and export repression beyond their borders. But looking at the brave men and women of Ukraine makes me optimistic. So does recent data telling us that our collective efforts embodied in international solidarity behind Ukraine make a difference. According to the Edelman Trust Barometer released on May 23rd, people in the United States the UK, Germany, and France reported notably higher levels of confidence in their democratic institutions in May of this year compared to January 2022. Now, while this is just one survey, I think the results begin to tell a story that we must keep pursuing. So while the global geostrategic balance and authoritarian tactics have changed immeasurably since 1982, the impetus from repressive governments and non-state actors alike to undermine democracy is the same. To respond to such threats, we're relying on our legacy infrastructure as well as introducing 21st century tools. For instance, we could not counter authoritarianism without the indispensable contributions of the National Endowment for Democracy and its family of organizations. NED Family is an enduring legacy of Westminster, and it will continue to be at the forefront of strengthening democratic institutions and safeguarding democracy worldwide. At the same time, we're refining our diplomatic and our foreign assistance approaches to modernize US efforts to advance our shared democratic goals. For example, in response to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the United States publicly exposed Kremlin disinformation networks through an unprecedented, timely declassification of US intelligence. Also, we're bolstering the cybersecurity of the Ukrainian government and maximizing global support on the use of export controls, sanctions, and visa restrictions to achieve our objectives. For example, the US administration has announced sanctions and visa restrictions on over 3,000 Russian and Belarusian officials, proxies, and private individuals. These people were involved in corruption, committed unconscionable human rights abuses, violated Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, or took actions that suppressed dissent and undermined democracy. In the face of such sustained authoritarian overreach, the Biden administration is taking a three-pronged approach to promote and protect democracy that integrates these 21st century tools. So let me briefly highlight our approach. First, we're shoring up our alliances and partnerships to advance a common vision and a unified front in the face of authoritarian overreach. The clearest example of this is Ukraine. The United States has rallied allies and partners to defend Ukraine's democracy, push back against Russia's aggression, and impose unprecedented costs to curtail the ability of Putin's regime to conduct its illegal war. This is exactly the type of global democratic solidarity that President Biden had in mind when he hosted the Summit for Democracy last year. This was the largest gathering of world leaders the United States has ever convened, with 100 leaders coming together, with hundreds of civil society organizations in the private sector over 3 days to make concrete commitments to build democratic resilience and counter authoritarianism around the world. Governments made over 740 specific commitments at last year's virtual summit. During this 2022 year of action, we are working around the clock to ensure that these pledges are fulfilled. Now, an integral component of rallying our alliances is reasserting US multilateral leadership, most notably in the UN Human Rights Council. We are leveraging our leadership in the UN and elsewhere to work with the global community to stand up to authoritarianism, as well as to open and protect space for civil society globally. On March 2nd, 141 members of the UN General Assembly voted to condemn Russia's war against Ukraine. And just 2 days later, 34 of the 49 members of the Human Rights Council voted to establish an independent commission of inquiry into human rights abuses by Russia and Ukraine. On April 7th, 93 UN member states voted to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, only the second time in the Council's history this has happened. The United States, along with our allies and partners, are keeping Russia's illegal war and the devastating and widening impacts at the top of the UN Security Council's agenda. At the UN Ministerial on Global Food Security 2 weeks ago, we focused the world on the growing food security crisis caused by Putin's brutal and irresponsible aggression. We'll continue to leverage multilateral fora to highlight how Russia and other malign actors are misusing technology to erode global peace and destroy all forms of security. These efforts are bolstered by our shared commitment to human rights as part of our foreign policy DNA. We saw such bipartisan commitment in congressional adoption of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which President Biden signed into law last December. The act prevents the importation of goods into the United States that are tainted with the use of forced labor in Xinjiang, where the PRC continues to commit genocide and crimes against humanity against predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups. Furthermore, we're working with our allies and partners around the globe to hold the PRC accountable for these atrocities. Last year, along with the EU, UK, and Canada, we took joint action to impose financial and visa restrictions on several individuals and entities responsible for the atrocities in Xinjiang. Second, we're broadening the chorus of champions to defend democracy. Today's threats demand that we update our approaches and expand our collaboration beyond our invaluable transatlantic allies. As part of their summit commitments, Japan appointed a senior government official to advise the Prime Minister on human rights, with whom I am working directly to partner on countering authoritarianism globally. Lithuania is bringing together frontline democracies like Chile, Moldova, Nepal, and Zambia that are at the forefront of creating resilient democracies and encouraging global cooperation to push back against authoritarian regimes. Beyond the context of the Summit for Democracy, there's the leadership role of the Gambia to safeguard human rights. Its seminal case against Burma for its alleged violations of the Genocide Convention against Rohingya is an excellent example. The Department of State is proud to have supported this case by sharing information, which helped inform Secretary Blinken's own determination that the Burmese military committed genocide and crimes against humanity against Rohingya. Broadening the chorus, though, is not just about governments. Democracies deliver better results when they engage businesses and labor. So we're strengthening our work with the private sector and workers to understand the many threats they're facing from those pushing authoritarian models. Democratic governance drives a bigger bottom line, and Russia's unjustified war against Ukraine has shown that businesses and labor play a vital role in reinforcing democratic values. We saw the impact of this collaboration between our government and the private sector in the creation of Welcome.us to support Afghan asylum seekers who have come to the United States, and the expansion of these efforts to support those now coming from Ukraine. Also, we see it in how the global labor movement marshaled funds and manpower to help the ongoing humanitarian effort in Europe, including educating Ukrainian school children displaced in Poland. Another critical partner is civil society, as we recognize that governments cannot succeed in this endeavor alone. So we're expanding and diversifying the civil society groups with which we engage to reach the activists on the front lines. This includes leaders in the areas of racial equity, labor, anti-corruption, faith communities, global conflict resolution, gender equality, LGBTQI+ human rights, disability, indigenous issues, and others. This summer, we'll be consulting dozens of organizations representing diaspora groups and global movements on democracy reform on how we can use the Summit for Democracy to truly rally global citizens. This is in addition to the more than 1,400 domestic and international civil society groups with which we already engage as part of the Summit for Democracy's Year of Action. As your report points out, such engagement is vital, and it sends a strong signal to the world that civil society is an equal partner with us in defending freedom and democracy. Third, we're modernizing our foreign policy and foreign assistance toolkit. Recognizing corruption's corrosive impact on emerging and established democracies, the White House launched the first U.S. strategy on countering corruption in 2021. To support this strategy, the State Department is working with the Departments of Treasury and Justice and is providing over $15 million to launch the Democracies Against Safe Havens initiative. This initiative will build the capacity of partner governments to deny corrupt actors the ability to hide ill-gotten gains and promote accountability by building a larger coalition to impose sanctions and visa restrictions. Moreover, we're partnering with other governments to expand the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, which in its first 4 years generated more than 200 law enforcement investigations or arrests, legislative or policy changes, sanctions against corrupt actors, and institutional actions, including personnel dismissals. The strength of our commitment to working with partners against corruption is evidenced by our foreign assistance investment, which in fiscal year 2020 equaled approximately $258 million for anti-corruption programming. The United States is continuing to lead globally by hosting the 2023 Conference of States Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. This conference is a critical opportunity for us to work with our partners to positively shape the global anti-corruption agenda for years to come. Furthermore, we will soon announce a first ever global coordinator on anti-corruption at the State Department to align building-wide efforts and better support our embassies in the field on this core national security priority. We're also developing new approaches to address growing misuse of digital technologies by authoritarian regimes. To this end, the United States and our partners are developing a voluntary code of conduct on export controls and human rights during this 2020 year of action. This framework will help reduce the potential for human rights abuses enabled by dual-use technologies, such as surveillance tools. At the same time, the Biden administration has taken several actions to hold the companies accountable that are developing, supplying, or using spyware or other technologies that enable this malicious activity, including through entity listing. Across this vital democratic renewal agenda, we must make our policy and assistance more inclusive, diverse, and equitable. This starts at home, in building a State Department workforce that better represents America in all its diversity. I'm thrilled to support Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, our first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, in leading this charge. We also need to ensure, though, that our foreign policies and assistance programs embrace diversity and equity. So as part of the Summit for Democracy's Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, we committed to provide up to $33.5 million to launch the Advancing Women and Girls Civic and Political Leadership Initiative, which will help facilitate the full and safe exercise of women's rights and representation. Additionally, we announced up to $5 million to launch the Global LGBTQI+ Inclusive Democracy Empowerment Glide Fund. This is a new program that will facilitate the participation and leadership of LGBTQI+ community members in democratic institutions. We also proposed a record $2.6 billion to advance gender equity and equality through foreign assistance requested in fiscal year 23, more than doubling the commitment proposed the previous year. Finally, modernizing our toolkit requires greater flexibility and agility within our foreign assistance structures to support democratic reformers. As part of the Summit for Democracy, the State Department launched the Fund for Democratic Renewal with pooled funds from bureaus under my direction. The goal here is to establish a flexible fund that prioritizes new approaches and risk-taking within the confines of our current appropriations, and we look forward to further collaboration with Congress to this end. So let me end by talking about where I think we go from here. First, today's democracy agenda must reflect today's challenges. It must include new leaders, new voices, new ideas, and new approaches. We need to embrace the issues on which citizens feel democracies are failing to deliver, whether that's on corruption or human rights, or equitable access to clean water, housing, and work. Second, we need to build our own U.S. capacity to meet today's challenges. At the State Department, we recently launched a new Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau as part of Secretary Blinken's modernization of American diplomacy. Third, there's a need to catalyze bipartisan support in Congress for democratic renewal, which includes ensuring we're regularly speaking, collaborating, and sharing our ideas. We seek to engage in an open dialogue about what authorities and resources we need to meet the challenges of the 21st century and to be held accountable when we don't meet the mark. Lastly, we need to be honest about the work we need to do here at home. America's global leadership is stronger when we candidly talk about and confront our democracy challenges at home. As President Biden and Secretary Blinken say often, it is that constant striving to fix our flaws towards a more perfect union that sets democracies apart. President Reagan's call on the global community to shore up the infrastructure of democracy is as meaningful today as it was in 1982. And a free press, independent labor unions, a robust civil society, free and fair elections, equal protection under the rule of just laws, and independent judicial systems are just as indispensable today as they were in 1982. We have a tall order before us at home and abroad, but I'm grateful to count on you all as partners and occasional critics as we roll up our sleeves and get to work. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much for those remarks. Really exactly, I think I'm looking at our co-chairs of the Westminster Working Group, what we had hoped for, taking the ideas that fueled President Reagan's actions and the creation of the NED. I should acknowledge the presence of Carl Gershman, a long time, until recently, leader of the NED, and was there from its inception. And seeing, how it should be applied today, where we're succeeding and where we need to improve and tackling the challenges. Let me start with the report, which I'm grateful to have the opportunity to review and reference in your remarks. And one of the things that we did, as I shamelessly promote our report here, while I have the Undersecretary present, but we did a preamble, and it was really a device that I think the members of the working group embraced, where the exercise was, if there was a presidential speech today, 40 years after President Reagan delivered the Westminster speech, what would that president say?
Right.
What would President Biden say? I'm not pushing a President Biden speech, but if he wants to, go for it. And one of the things that biased, but I think it came out well, but I'm going to highlight one piece of it where, while the infrastructure of Americans' democracy promotions organizations has continually evolved, and that was clear in the inquiry of the working group. This is not a stale set of organizations that, it's kind of still living in the 1980s. That's not the case at all. It states we have not adapted apace with the schemes of today's autocrats and dictators, specifically. And that's where I want to start with you. Long time of service in the Foreign Service, now in this role, a lot of initiatives embedded throughout your remarks there, and the Biden administration is obviously focusing on this. Are we keeping a pace? Are we ahead? Do you feel, where are we? Do you agree with that assessment? Are we keeping a pace?
I think, Roger, I would answer by saying I think one of our biggest risks is complacency. So I'm hesitant, to be triumphant and say we're keeping the pace. We can let our foot off the gas. Everything's good. We have to keep driving this agenda. And, as President Biden has said, the defining challenge of our times is the contest between autocracy and democracy. And he said that before February 24th, but I think his words have been proven prescient as we are mobilizing the world to answer to Russia's just unconscionable violations of Ukrainian sovereignty and ongoing effort to destroy Ukraine's democracy. So I prefer to answer the question more with an imperative. We have to keep pace and we have to prevail. And I think with that comes, a realization that, we're defined by our times and context, and particularly what is different now, I would say, in the post-Cold War, post-Soviet context is technology, as both a driver of almost unimaginable growth, innovation, and opportunity, but also as a disruptor, as one which the report, I think, lays out quite well and makes a case for the need to really center emerging technology and innovation in our approaches to renewing democracy globally. A second piece, though, I would say, is recognizing what some of the core threats are that maybe have not been part of a focused U.S. national security effort. And there I mentioned anti-corruption in my remarks, which President Biden, has really put a premium on elevating anti-corruption as a national security priority, but also recognizing the threat it poses both to emerging democracies, but to established ones, as well as the fuel it provides to authoritarians like Putin, like Lukashenko, and others to expand their reach.
Yeah, and the report certainly focused on that. Our co-chairs emphasized challenges posed by corruption, what we need to do, and there's some recommendations tied to it. But, in your response, I think rightly, you focus on Russia's war in Ukraine.
Right.
And President Reagan gave this speech 40 years ago, focusing on freedom and democracy, but at the same time, there were people protesting outside Westminster because President Reagan had a parallel program of peace through strength, and really emphasizing military strength. For you and your portfolio, and for the Biden administration, the emphasis on strengthening freedom and democracy around the world, how pivotal is it that we win, that Ukraine wins and rolls back Russia out of Ukraine for your portfolio, for what you're focused on?
Oh, it's absolutely indispensable. And the fact is Ukraine is winning and Russia is experiencing a strategic defeat, and the Ukrainian people totally defied Putin's, vast underestimation of their will, but he also underestimated the unity of the transatlantic alliance, of the international community. When I mentioned some of the UN votes that have taken place, these are quite noteworthy. This was every regional group represented in that overwhelming vote of the General Assembly to suspend Russia for the Human Rights Council. We had very strong representation by the countries who took part in the Summit for Democracy. And part of these efforts are, as I said, to broaden the chorus, to expand the circle, to, of course, deepen our indispensable cooperation with treaty allies in this effort, but to make clear that the free world is not going to be a bystander or passive in the face of such outrages.
So from the battlefield to the UN, we need to be pressing and pushing back on Russia. Take on the outlook of another Secretary of State, one who's been in the headlines recently, a 99-year-old former Secretary of State that still commands the headlines, who is focused on, and it's a serious argument that's gotten serious attention, and one that really goes to the heart of what you work on. And that is this notion that we have to be mindful of humiliating Russia. That's somehow a realist outlook, which I want to get to as we relate to other countries would argue for the off-ramp as opposed to the rollback. How do you address those who want us to develop off-ramp rather than rollback, like Secretary Kissinger?
Well, I would commend to everyone to read President Biden's op-ed that was published in the New York Times overnight, where I think he lays out very clearly, what we are doing in Ukraine and why the United States has taken, such a decisive stand in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, because it matters for the fate of the world as we know it. But in that, I think he's also laid out, a rationale for supporting the Ukrainians' ability to defend themselves so they can negotiate according to their will that ultimate diplomatic solution, which the Russians have categorically rejected in actions since February 24th. Let's make no mistake of who the aggressor here is and what the stakes are for the United States and the world.
So the notion that great powers to negotiate over the head of President Zelensky, a sovereign a country over their sovereign territory, is not something that will have space within the Biden administration.
No, it's categorically rejected. I think the mantra since February has been, nothing about you without you.
Nothing about you without you. Great. Let's go from one serious challenge in terms of adversaries. No adversary more relevant and urgent than Russia at the moment, certainly with your portfolio. But President Biden this month will also be in the Middle East and reporting today. Perhaps it's out of the White House. I read a news report, so I'll just attribute it to that. Will be in Saudi Arabia and will planning to engage with MBS, right? And this would be the first time since the Khashoggi murder that President of the United States, President Biden, will engage with essentially the in effect leader of Saudi Arabia. Not a new situation, actually. We deal with Westminster in 1982. These were things that President Reagan's own ambassador to UN wrote about, Jeane Kirkpatrick, prior to becoming the ambassador to UN, how you manage so-called realpolitik considerations and advance our values of freedom and democracy. But take us through how you approach dealing with allies and friends and partners whose human rights records are troubling, and the realpolitik considerations that any administration, be it a Reagan administration or a Biden administration, take into account. We have some serious challenges, obviously, dealing with Russia and Ukraine, and inflation at home, and oil and gas needs, and so this is all coming in and complicating perhaps what is otherwise a very pure outlook.
Well, to the first part of your question, Roger, I can't comment on any of the White House plans for travel, so I'll direct you to the White House for that.
I'm not going to best the Washington Post here on stage,
exactly. No scoops. But no, you raised a very important question, and I think it's a challenge that successive administrations have contended with. But I think what's critical is the recognition, which I read loud and clear in the report, that U.S. values and interests are one. If we proceed from an assumption that somehow our values are at conflict with our interests, I think we reach false conclusions. And we can walk, chew gum, and engage in diplomacy at the same time. There are many interests at play in some of the countries that you mentioned, but I think it's critical that we are true to our words and commitments with respect to human rights. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, I think you saw, in the first year of this administration, announcement of new measures, such as the Khashoggi visa ban, to hold account perpetrators of transnational repression against dissidents or other human rights actors. It is, I think, one of the wonderful privileges I have in my role as Undersecretary is overseeing our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which every year, and they just did it a little over a month ago, puts out an annual report on human rights practices for every country in the world, including our closest allies, as well as some of our, more thorny adversaries. But they apply a common standard in those reports. It is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not an American invented measure. It is, freedom of expression, freedom of association, arbitrary killings, et cetera. And that is public information. It is the most widely read report published by the Department of State, and we don't pull punches in that information. We put it forward in a neutral way, and one in which I think it's for the world at large to read and be informed by. And it does inform our diplomacy, absolutely.
So we can do both, is what I hear you saying. Keep our friends, but also hold them accountable.
Absolutely.
Another Reagan throwback, but Secretary of State Schultz was really advanced the linkage kind of approach to diplomacy, where when he was dealing with Soviet Union in his day, there was always the matters of arms control and great power diplomacy, but at the same time, the plight of dissidents and the plight, human rights considerations were always at the forefront. One I want to focus on is one of my favorite examples, and love to get your reaction to. I didn't hear much of it in the speech. It's not critique, just perhaps give you an opportunity to add to it. Is the role of dissidents in all of this? If you look at President Reagan's diaries, his first note to Brezhnev, the handwritten note, began with the plight of Sharansky. And then the State Department drafted memo followed. Always started with the plight of a human being who's political, right? And human rights were being violated. And it's a wonderful kind of testament to the Reagan presidency, because at the end of his diaries, you find Sharansky again as a free man. Right. And it's just a wonderful bookend to 2 terms in office. And I use that as a metaphor, I think, of the power of linkage. Are we doing that enough? Who are the dissidents of today that we should be focusing on with respect to Russia, for example? You mentioned of a number of things that you're involved in the administrations on export controls, visa restrictions, sanctions, all of which, yay, and important. What about the dissidents?
Absolutely. I mean, the role of dissidents, of civil society champions in calling out human rights abuses and driving democratic reforms and openings is indispensable. So, one of the lines of effort within our Summit for Democracy last December was shining a light on the plight of political prisoners. It's just unacceptable in this age that we believe, over 1 million political prisoners all over the world. Secretary Blinken co-hosted a session with Lithuanian Foreign Minister Landsbergis, and we gave the opportunity for the families of these dissidents and political prisoners to tell their stories and to explain what it's like to have a family member torn away, sentenced to life in prison for merely seeking to drive positive change in their own country. This is a very important area of like-minded coordination for our government. So it's a topic of continual engagement with our treaty allies, with partners through the Summit for Democracy. Without revealing too much detail, I was engaged with a fellow European ally just before coming today on some very specific cases that we are working to move forward. So even though we may not always be talking about these cases publicly, they remain a vital part of our human rights diplomacy and our Summit for Democracy
It's
effort.
amazing, though, how one person, one name somehow can animate and
absolutely.
capture the attention of the world, whether Navalny or Alai, whoever it is. Not they're a tool per se, but it just shows that the story itself, it could drive so much focus, attention, and advance the very portfolio which you're working on.
Right.
Russia, of course, is the urgent challenge. We've talked a little bit about that. But there is one that's as important, if perhaps not more important, you hit on your speech, is China.
Yeah.
And talk about complexity and the realpolitik voice and how you manage it. Taiwan, of course, is in the headlines. Hong Kong, until Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was the greatest assault on freedom that I witnessed in my lifetime. The China challenge. How do you reconcile that with? I'm a Pentagon guy, but the E, that's the Economic Bureau, right? Where you have to somehow, deal with the fact that you have these Fortune 500 companies. It's key to our economy. We're so integrated. How do those conversations go? How do you integrate with your colleagues where you're managing the economic interests of this country, which are key to our prosperity, which allows us to promote freedom and democracy, and then your portfolio, which of course is saying, hey, we have to hold this country to account? Only easy questions here today for you.
No. Well, Roger, I mean, it's a whole of State Department, it's a whole of U.S. government effort. So, again, I would commend to you all, Secretary Blinken gave a major policy speech on China last week at George Washington, which really laid out our approach. And, it is all about shaping the strategic environment in which the PRC operates. And on some of the critically important policy issues in my lane, combating forced labor, enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, this is a team effort between what we call the J family, our home of bureaus doing human rights, humanitarian assistance, anti-trafficking, and the E family, as well as working with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice on withhold and release orders to prevent products made by slave labor from entering our shores. And that is imposing a cost for China's ongoing genocidal and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. I think it's a compelling example and one that maybe is a bit surprising when people tend to think of these issues being in opposition as opposed to the integration of these considerations. And I think Americans in general want to know where their products are coming from and don't want to be part of an effort that results in purchase of products made by forced labor.
No doubt, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act has received bipartisan support. Congress was kind of leading it quite
right.
And at least in lockstep, perhaps ahead, according to some in the administration. We had the Winter Olympics.
Right.
We did a survey here at the Reagan Institute where we asked questions about views of Americans as it relates to human rights, and specifically about the Olympics and whether a boycott was something the United States ought to pursue. And it was quite interesting that diplomatic boycott was like, there's, which of course we did, but actually a corporate boycott was something that I believe had nearly 2/3 of Americans behind. Really supported. I mean, Americans absolutely care deeply about human rights. Was that a missed opportunity that we didn't do more at that moment? I mean, it obviously complicated diplomacy, but we have the Secretary of State and the Department of State and the U.S. government saying they're committing genocide, and then they're hosting the Olympics. I mean, it was as challenging as you can get during managing the various interests, our country's interests.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think with respect to the Olympics, the administration made it stand clear by not sending a diplomatic delegation. We saw the UK and another of other governments take similar action, but we also did not want to deny our athletes the opportunity that they had worked so hard for, and they proved themselves.
Yeah, and clearly the survey reinforced that. That wasn't something that I think had a majority support of Americans, those participating in the survey. So much more to hit on. We have a few minutes left, so I'm now going to look to this distinguished audience in the room. For those who have questions, just indicate you have a question by raising your hand, and one of my colleagues will give you a microphone. And I didn't even have to filibuster, Madam Undersecretary. The hands went up immediately.
Oh, boy.
So over here.
Great.
Oh, go ahead.
So the threading the needle, Madam Secretary, you mentioned earlier about democratic governance bolsters, augments the bottom line. Is there opportunity, and this gets a little bit more tactical, but the public reporting, like the human rights report that's open there, the investment climate statements that are interagency, and the growth in ESG attention, do you see that as another opportunity to infuse a little bit more information there? And I think about projects across interagency and in the private sector where these investment climate statements are looking, they're looking for more meat. I'm just curious as to, from the J family's perspective, if they see a bigger role in the ICSs.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point when we look at all the tools in our toolkit. And Roger, you raised an important question about, the business community and our economic bureau family and whether we're in opposition. I neglected to mention that, we put out 2 very critical business advisories for Hong Kong and Xinjiang that I think are a reflection of recognizing that we need to really move beyond a siloed approach and see things as, well, this is for the human rights people and then the business people are separate. You're absolutely correct. And, part of our ongoing efforts working, with our experts in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor and our colleagues and experts within the economic and business bureau sphere and the private sector is, I would say, updating our overall approach on business and human rights, where we have the UN guiding principles, which the US government played a very decisive role in shaping, but we need to adapt that to the era that we're in. And even within 10 years, we think about who dominates the landscape. It's critical that we not only keep pace, but we stay ahead. So, these are terrific ideas, and we've had a lot of outreach through U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other associations to bring the private sector in as a stakeholder. And so this isn't just an effort by the USG to tell them what to do, but we can work together because, failure to uphold the rule of law, not knowing whether your representatives can work freely in a country without disappearing or being taken hostage by an authoritarian regime. These are all factors that have to be brought out in investment climate statements and the other very transparent and vital products we have to inform American business and particularly SMEs who are looking to work internationally.
That's a great question. We have time for another couple of questions. Dan Twining from IRI.
Thanks. Hey, thanks, Roger. Great work by the team on this report. Thanks for coming to support it. I have a kind of a bit of a softball question that promotes the Reagan Institute. So a
Those
group
are
of
always
us,
welcome, Dan.
a group of us was briefed on Reagan Institute polling taken before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, showing that 82% of Americans believe America has an obligation to defend democracies from authoritarian aggression.
Okay.
I think we understate American support for this agenda in the world. There's polling from Freedom House and the Penn Biden Center and the Bush Institute and others showing that 2/3 of Americans understand the link between democracy and freedom abroad and our American way of life at home. Could you comment on how you see public support around this agenda? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Dan. We'll just use your question as part of our promotion efforts for the summit. Now, absolutely. I think that when we look at the overwhelming American public response to support Ukrainians, to support our Afghan allies, in the chaotic aftermath of the fall of Kabul, there is a recognition, as I said, that this is part of our DNA as Americans, regardless of where we're from in the country, what our political affiliations may be. It's an expectation. And as somebody who spent the better part of my professional career in the field, over 2 decades, there is that expectation in the world of America as well that doesn't apply really to any other countries. So I think we have to make good on that by better engaging America beyond the Beltway in this effort. So that is part of our Summit for Democracy, civil society consultation effort that I mentioned. we cherish, our valued longtime partners, within the Ned family, Freedom House, so many others who are represented here today. But we need to get out more and make sure that Americans understand what's at stake and what we're doing about it collectively together. And, those results only validate that we're pushing on an open door.
Last question before we let the Undersecretary go, and we'll go to Carl Gershman, who, of course, deserves the last question,
Great.
if not the last word.
Yeah.
No, but we're coming up next month on the 10th anniversary of the murder of Osvaldo Paya. And also an important biography is being published today
Right.
by David Hoffman. And the Biden administration is coming in for a lot of criticism for reaching out and making concessions on payments back home and so forth. They're trying to sort of revert to the Obama policy on Cuba. What is the Biden policy on Cuba at this time, and what might the administration do on the occasion of this very important and terrible anniversary? They murdered, in effect, the Zakheim of Cuba.
Right. No, Carl, thank you for raising, this tragic anniversary, but also for giving us an opportunity to explain our approach on Cuba. And, when President Biden exhorted us as diplomats to center human rights and democratic values in our foreign policy, that absolutely applies to Cuba. And I think what you've seen, particularly in response to the brutal crackdown that has ensued since the July manifestations of Cubans just trying to exercise, the right to freely associate, to demand better from a government which was failing to deliver for them. What did we see? We saw teenagers sentenced to decades in prison. Political prisoners are a number, in the hundreds, and their numbers are growing in Cuba. And I think this administration has been very clear. If you look at our human rights report that was just issued, that we are deeply concerned by the situation. This remains, a topic of continual engagement with our hemispheric partners, and the steps towards normalization, which did occur under the Obama administration, I think we're in a different context now, where the focus is to alleviate the suffering of the Cuban people, and I think many of the recent decisions were in that context, but to be absolutely resolute in standing up for their right to exercise their universal rights. And with that comes a demand to release all political prisoners.
Please join me in thanking Undersecretary Zeya for joining us today. Just a housekeeping note, we're going to adjust the stage here for our next panel, but first give an opportunity for the Undersecretary to exit the stage and get back to the State Department.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. No, Salvador. That's. Oh, that's great.
Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining us in person again. And of course, thank you to Undersecretary Zeya for joining us and for those really thoughtful remarks and discussion. As we begin now the second half of this afternoon's event, we'll be turning to the subject of the Westminster 2.0 Working Group itself. You heard Roger and the Undersecretary talk about the report hot off the presses today. For all of you in the room and anyone watching online can download at reaganfoundation.org/Westminster. And as we do that, I want to reflect a little bit as we start the panel, especially on something that really struck me during the Undersecretary's portion of the event, which was the amount of times that the word family was mentioned. She talked about the J family and the Ned family. And as I look around the room, it's great to feel that sense of sort of the Westminster family here in the room. So thank you so much for those that have joined us. Roger mentioned those who served on the working group as members, those who helped with the writing of the report, and also to the subject matter experts who briefed us along the way. It was a long time coming. It was a 2-year project for the Reagan Institute. And I like to say one way that we can measure sort of the length of effort that went into this project is that we went from one Ned president to the other. So Carl briefed us at our very first working group session, and Damon Wilson, who's joined us today as well, briefed us as Ned president at one of our final working group sessions. You know, over the course of the time that we've convened the working group, I got to know my esteemed panelists here quite well. They need very little introduction in a room full of self-selecting freedom and democracy fans, so I will do that. I will give you a little introduction, especially for our guests who are joining us virtually as well. To my right is Ambassador Mark Green, the president of the Wilson Center and the former president of the International Republican Institute. Ken Wollack, the chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy and the longtime president of the National Democratic Institute. Nicole Bibbins-Sadeka, the executive vice president of Freedom House, who served for many years at the State Department working on democracy and human rights issues. And finally, Jeff Gedman, the current editor-in-chief of the magazine American Purpose and also the former head of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I think the collective experience of this panel positions them well not only to comment on kind of the broader themes of advancing freedom and democracy in today's world, but to the point of today's report launch, Mark and Ken, of course, co-chaired the working group, and Nicole and Jeff served as working group members. So thank you to you all for joining us. To get things started, I'd like to just ask each of you to reflect to start on what's changed in the world since 1982 when President Reagan delivered the Westminster Address. We heard Undersecretary Zeya talk about the enduring relevance of the speech. The video that we started with, I think, drives home the point that President Reagan's words are as relevant in some ways today as they were in 1982, given the challenges we face. But whether it's challenges or new opportunities that have emerged over the course of the 40 years, what's the most significant change from the 40 years that have passed? Mark?
Well, there are lots of details we'll talk about during this discussion in terms of the tools that are available to us. But what's striking to me is that the terms of the debate have changed. So back in 1982, there were open discussions about whether, in fact, democracy was the preferable form of government. And you had these great ideological battles. That's not the case anymore. People around the world know that democracy is the right form of government to help people self-realize their aspirations. The fight now is in a different place. Authoritarians don't argue against democracy. Instead, they bend the rules of democracy to their will. They try to fix the game. So you get people like Maduro saying, well, I'm a Democrat. I have elections all the time. Sometimes only one candidate, and all of the stuffed ballot boxes and stolen ballot boxes. So to me, the big change is we won the argument, and now there's a new one. And this new argument is more complicated. It's more difficult to take on in many ways because of all the tools that the authoritarians have at their disposal. So won the argument, but we're engaged in a new complicated battle that we dare not lose.
Ken?
As Roger mentioned, Freedom House and others have chronicled a decade and a half of democratic decline. And while I don't want to dismiss the fire hose of bad news because it is real, rather I think it's important to provide a degree of perspective, another picture that includes a slightly longer sweep of history. And the world was pretty bleak 40 years ago. And I've always thought about whether it was more ambitious, more audacious for the endowment to be established 40 years ago than would have been to establish it now. And I think a case could be made for that. If you look at Latin America, it was dominated by military regimes. In Asia, there were military regimes in Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Korea, martial law in Taiwan, an absolute monarchy in Nepal, one-man rule in the Philippines and Indonesia, communist rule in Mongolia. In Africa, there was an apartheid regime in Pretoria, again a military regime in Lagos. And if you look at the continent more broadly, between 1960 and 1990, there were 4 African heads of state that stepped down voluntarily after losing an election. And the subsequent 30 years, that figure rose to more than 50. The lexicon of democracy hadn't even entered the politics in the Arab Middle East, and of course the Soviet Union's reach and occupation extended to Western Europe and throughout Eurasia. I think there are 2 developments that have changed. One, I think Mark alluded to, and that is people are in a demanding mood. They want to put food on the table, and they want to have a political voice, and they're not willing to forfeit the latter for the former. And if you look at protest movements and other indicators in polls, you can see that the demand for a better democracy or democracy has risen over the last 40 years. And second of all, 40 years ago, the only organizations that were engaged in this work were basically the German party foundations that played such an important role in Spain and Portugal in the 1970s. And when the NED came along, there were no donor aid agencies, there were no governments, there were no intergovernmental organizations dedicated to this proposition. And today you have networks of interparliamentary groups, intergovernmental groups, civic organizations, inter-party groups that are engaged in this effort. And there is today an architecture and an ecosystem that didn't exist 40 years ago. Now it operates unevenly, and it doesn't always work. And I think the challenge today is not creating what Tom Melia once said, the Central Committee for Pluralism, but how do you really coalesce all of these various groups and initiatives that have emerged over the last 40 years to make this work better.
Nicole.
First off, thanks for having us. It's wonderful just to see this project come together in a beautiful report that really is impactful. Echoing what my colleague said, I would say 3 things I can see as really important markers. So one is the norms have shifted, right? I think the norms were, as Mark said, really under debate in the 80s, and there wasn't a clear direction of which side was going to win. And I don't think that is under debate, but it is unquestionably under attack. And I think it is because authoritarians have gotten a little savvier. They use the language of democracy. It was, so wonderful to see Putin and Xi come together to talk about their democracies together earlier in the year. And so they're co-opting the language, but they're also very intentionally undermining the institutions and the infrastructure that allowed, I think, President Reagan to have that platform that he used so well in 1982. The second is regions, right? I think also in 1982 there was a debate about whether this was a concept that was only applicable to one region or another. There were so many comments about Latin America. You can't actually have, their Chaldeos and the Catholic Church, and in Asia it just doesn't really match the culture. And there's not that debate, because when you look around the world, the people in Hong Kong, the people in Venezuela, the people in Sudan, the people in Ukraine are the people who are giving us all hope and inspiration that democracy is not something that anyone else is telling them to do. It's something that they very much feel. And so I think that conversation about whether this is something which only belongs to one region or other is certainly not under legitimate debate. The last piece I would say is the connectivity that we have in the world, and we'll get to the issue of technology, and we'll get to issue of what that means, but the fact that information is so readily available, support is so much easier to provide than it was 40 years ago, and authoritarians have much stronger ability to reach out to others for their repression, means that the game has changed significantly, right? That connectivity has swung both ways, both in the favor of the authoritarian as well as the favor of the human rights defenders around the world.
Jeff.
Thank you, Rachel. I will follow Nicole with my own three observations. I'd like to say that 40 years later we're smarter and wiser. It certainly, as Mark said, in my view, a more complicated set of challenges for a variety of reasons. First, it seems to me over the last 4 decades, one thing we've learned, and now we have a realization, that while the yearning for freedom is universal, translating that yearning into democratic institutional terms can be very difficult, demanding, requiring of patience, and circumstances and conditions vary region to region and country to country. The second thing that I would say, Rachel, is that the realization, I would say the reality now exists, and this is new and this is different, while it's still the case in their own way, in their own style, that dictators weaponize information and see truth not as objective reality but as an expression of power. Now suddenly in the United States and across the West and in democracies around the world, we have in our own countries demagogues who weaponize information and see truth as an extension, expression of power in our media landscapes and our politics. That changes the debate at home and affects our ability to extend democracy abroad. The third thing that I would note has to do with generation. It's my view, and I broad brush, but it's my view that if you're in the United States and you're under 40 and you're not inside our bubble, I love our bubble. This is my bubble, okay? But if you're under 40 in this country and outside of this bubble, you are apt to see an exercise like this as an exercise in nostalgia, legacy, establishment, the elites again, and I think that's wrong-headed and misguided, and it's every bit as applicable and relevant today, but I think that's a narrative to battle and work of persuasion to be done. And if you're over 40, okay, I think that we need to recognize that there are new generations with different points of orientation, different perspectives, different priorities, and we and they want to see us check our own blind spots and our own assumptions of what's worked, what hasn't worked, and why. 3 thoughts.
Thank you for each of those observations, and I think in their own ways, hearing the 4 of you talk through sort of those different aspects of how the world has changed, how the dynamics have changed both domestically and internationally, really lay the groundwork for a lot of the content that's in the report. Before we kind of dive in on the report itself, the key themes and recommendations, Maybe just, I hope it's not an exercise in nostalgia, but maybe one other question just as a scene setter on digging in a bit on the Westminster speech itself and the legacy of President Reagan's speech itself. You know, we understand it to be one of his most impactful in terms of the solidification of his legacy and the ongoing relevance of his legacy. I wonder if each of you could offer kind of a few observations, and Ken, maybe I'll ask you to start here, just about that near term, or maybe others kind of on the longer term, but Ken, to start, sort of the immediate aftermath of the Westminster speech and the way that it led to the creation of the democracy promotion architecture we have here at home and around the world, as you mentioned. Connect some of those dots for us.
I'll try to be brief, and I'm reluctant to do so with Carl sitting in the room. And if he was a tweeter, he would be leaving after this talk to tweet and correct the history. But I think it really was, at the time, I don't think it was seemed to those who supported this initiative audacious. Dante Fascell, who was really spearheaded this effort in Congress and was the administration's partner on this, the then chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said this was something that everyone will love. Labor, business, the two political parties. Little did he know, he said, that it was something for everybody to dislike, because if all of these groups could support this, you had to be suspicious about this initiative. And at the time, and this was for several years, you had Jesse Helms, who hated it, and Orrin Hatch, who loved it, and Ted Kennedy, who was a strong advocate, and Barney Frank, who was an opponent, and you never knew which shoulder to look over. And they had different reasons for support and opposition, which I won't get into. It had to do with the Cold War, it had to do with cultural imperialism, suspicion of the Reagan administration. But I think two events changed it. Now, Carl and I have argued about this, but I think the snap elections in the Philippines in 1986 and the plebiscite in Chile in 1988. And I think for Democrats, they said, this wasn't simply a Cold War tool, that here we were challenging, and the endowment and the institutes were challenging authoritarianism among quote-unquote friends of the United States in this larger struggle against Soviet communism. And so they became instant, I think, supporters of the endowment. And for the right, who had made the argument that the alternative to Pinochet or the alternative to Marcos was the communist insurgency, they began to understand that there was a symbiotic relationship between the dictator and the communist insurgency, and they needed each other, and they drew strength from each other. And there was an alternative. When the people of both countries were given an opportunity to express their views, there was a large middle in these countries, from left of center to right of center. And I think the debate changed in Washington to the point where those years and years and years of fights on the floors of the Senate and the House, and I and others were engaged almost on a daily basis on these fights. This was over a $30 million appropriation, and the debates lasted 5-6 hours. That debate doesn't exist today. And this is something that has united Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, and liberal. And this is a broad consensus issue today among politicians, among Congress, in Congress. And that's a huge sea change, I think, over the past 40 years.
Mark, you've worked both in government on these issues and also in civil society, leading one of the NED institutes at IRI. How do you see kind of the ongoing legacy of the speech itself in terms of the work, particularly from the civil society perspective?
Well, a couple of thoughts. First off, we should remember that this democracy movement was not a light switch that suddenly went on. So Reagan didn't give the speech, and the next week the NED was created and everything took off. It took a long time to build and forge these institutions. What I think is important to remember is that Reagan's speech also connected the U.S. to something larger going on. Look back at Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. It's remarkable some of the themes in that speech and how they link up and parallel to the themes in Reagan's speech. And in both cases, they were misread. So take a look at some of the criticism of the Reagan speech and the Iron Curtain speech. Reagan was a warmonger, Churchill was a warmonger. They misunderstood entirely what Churchill and Reagan were trying to do. They're trying to mobilize ideas and aspirations. So I think early on, misread, it took a while for it to sink in and to start to see some of the results. And then the other thing that I would point to, I always harken back to a conversation I had with Brent Scowcroft, who was on the IRI board for some time. And as he was retiring from the board, I asked him, we were talking about the reunification of Germany and the growth of democracy in Europe. I asked him if he had a message for today's young people. And he paused and he said, tell them it wasn't easy. He said, all of us have this idea that, of course, Germany is reunified. Of course, these things pop out. He said, we almost blew it. We almost failed over and over again. He said his message to young people was, it wasn't easy then, it's not easy now, and it won't be easy in the future. If anybody's expecting an easy course, that's not the way this works. Working with civil society, that connective tissue between citizens and their leaders, this is really, really hard, always was, always will be, but look what it produces and what we get as a result.
Jeff, from your perspective, having worked particularly during your time at RFERL abroad and sort of serving the people who are doing the work of advancing freedom and democracy on the ground, how do you see the legacy of the speech itself in that realm?
So I'll give you two quick stories that I think help illustrate that. So I'm now on the board of my former company, Radio Free Europe and Liberty, led brilliantly by Jamie Fly. Jamie Fly is in Central Asia this week. I traveled as RFERL held Central Asia, and I remember, where was it? Uzbekistan, I think, meeting with a group of young people who were watching, listening, following, reading RFERL, and in the hour-long coffee conversation with them, they all kept giggling. I had no idea why until I pushed, and then they finally told me, revealed that they all thought that it's CIA media, and I'm part of the CIA apparatus to, and I said, well, if that were true, you've just told me that you watch, listen, follow, read every week. Why is that? And they said, well, it turns out to be accurate and reliable. Okay? I said, oh, well, that's good to know. Credibility matters. Fact-based journalism matters as a source of information and inspiration. The other story that I relate quickly, Rachel, is the following, and it's a companion piece to what you said, Ken, about the impact during the time. I remember not the first part of the 1980s, but the second half of the decade. As a young American, I was here in Washington, D.C., if you wish to know, as a German teacher at Gonzaga College High School during the day, and at night working my PhD at Georgetown in German area studies. And every break I had during the year, I was traveling to Eastern Europe, mostly to Eastern Germany. Spring break, Christmas break, summer break, playing hooky, whatever it was. And here's the story. This would have been about 2 years before the wall fell. And this is the impact of that speech. There's no doubt about it. A friend of mine, Crystal, who worked for the East German Railway, said, I want you to come over to Sunday dinner with my extended family in Dresden. You'll love it. So here I am, young American Jeff Gedman, and there I am in this home with about 20 people sitting around the table. 70-something, 20-something kids running around, 2 military officers, East German National Forces, a teacher from the local Marxist-Leninist high school. So I was just kind of keeping my head down out of trouble. I have no idea who I'm with except my friend Crystal. Dinner goes on, and at one point, one of the elderly gentlemen, her grandfather, clinks his glass and says, we've got one American. I want to know what you think about President Reagan. 19 people looking at me. I have no idea. I'm collect collecting my thoughts. I like President Reagan. And he interrupts and he says, I'll tell you what I think. I think, thank God, that the American president has the nerve in this part of the world to stand up for freedom and against tyranny. And then there's this long silence. I was waiting for blood flowing and forks flying, and I kid you not, 18, 17, 19 people around the table, they're all nodding. Little kids are nodding, the guy from Marxist-Leninist High School is nodding, the colonel in the East German Communist military are nodding. I was stunned. So, you know that was then, but you can encounter that story countless times in countless countries today. That speech, for us Americans, for me, I'll say, it's easy to underestimate its value. It's powerful and profound.
Nicole, Freedom House makes such an important contribution with their annual rankings that we've talked about, especially in terms of the Democratic decline over the last decade and a half, but Freedom House has been doing rankings quite a bit longer than that. Yeah. Talk about, from your perspective, kind of the legacy of the speech, particularly in that longer scope of history.
You bet. And I think, I feel like these days we get paid almost every time we can say 16 years of democratic decline. But I do think taking the longer view is an absolutely essential one for any of us in this community, because if you look back in 1982, 33% of the world's population, 33% of the countries at that time were free. We have the free, partly free, and not free countries. And now we're around 42%. And that's not, even after the 16 years of decline, that's not an unimpressive number. I mean, the fact that we have had this forward momentum for 40 years is a indication of the courage of the people that Ken walked through in so many different countries, fighting courageously on the ground to bring that transition, but it is also a reflection that we've had 40 years and more of external actors supporting those on the ground to bring those changes, right? And so the fact that we have a higher number today, even after the decline that we have seen, is a really positive story. And it's one I think that as we look back at 40 years, we have to really draw that. I will link it, though, to the importance of this report and sort of the importance of this moment in Washington, it's always great when you can manipulate numbers to say whatever you want. We have, there are 42% of the countries today that are free countries. But if you look at it from a population standpoint, the story is a little bit different. And at that point, in 1982, 39% of the world's population lived in a free country. We've hovered a little bit over that percentage. Since then, it's gone up to the mid-40s, but it's dropped down to 20% of the world's population. Over the last couple years, it's dropped in large part because of the rollbacks in India, and India being such a populous country. But I do think all of those numbers that I throw out give us two narratives that we have to really hold in tension at the same time, which is progress has been made, but progress has been made because our shoulders have been to the wheel, and we're at a pivotal point where we have to renew that energy, because if the population that is living freely is going down, then we really are at a point where we have to really galvanize, think about those recommendations to reinvigorate what that progress has been driven by.
I want to turn now to kind of the key themes and recommendations of the report itself, and take a few minutes just to offer an overview as we do so. So as we heard earlier, the Westminster 2.0 working group is really charged with this mission of re-envisioning, reimagining, revitalizing what a Westminster approach for the 21st century would be, what's changed in the last 40 years as we started with, and what and how should our efforts, the resources that we dedicate against them, the strategy itself, modernize and adapt. We've focused in the report on several broad themes. One is leveraging new technologies to advance freedom. And I should note that each of these themes, the working group sort of settled on as something that's either new or kind of renewed importance as we think about today's world in the 21st century. One, if you'll indulge me, one brief anecdote on the technology point that we've been talking about as we've prepared for the Westminster launch, just thinking about how much, of course, the world has changed, particularly the way in which technology has changed the way in which we interact with each other and communicate with each other. When President Reagan delivered the Westminster Address 40 years ago next week, he had one of these fine teleprompter devices before him at the British Parliament at Westminster, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher actually wrote in her memoirs years later that it was the first time she had seen one of these devices, and she assumed that it was some sort of security device, these plexiglass shields, guarding the president, but she learned later that it was the first time she had seen a teleprompter. And as we think about presidential addresses before the British Parliament today, when President Zelensky spoke not just to the British Parliament, but to the US Congress, he did so, of course, from Kyiv via video conference technology, half a world away. So technology, clearly a key theme that the working group honed in on. Thinking about the synergies and strengthening the synergies between our anti-corruption efforts and our democratization efforts, and the link between those two. To that point, also a third key theme around journalism, the role of a free and independent media toward exposing the corruption of dictatorial regimes, and more broadly to allowing for the kind of transparency that democratic governance allows. Empowering international cooperation. Ken, you spoke earlier to the architecture internationally that exists in new ways compared with 40 years ago. And finally, recommitting to core principles, right? So what do we know works, and how can we lean into those aspects? Let me ask each of you to kind of comment on one or more of these themes. Jeff, why don't I start with you kind of on the journalism point, how this institution matters to free societies and how it's under attack in unfree ones.
So Rachel, I know we all agree that a strategy requires a variety of elements, and this report comprises many or most of those elements. In my view, I think it's a given that I can't think of a democracy anywhere in history or around the world that functions without an informed citizenry and a vibrant civil society. And so in my view, free and independent, and I will add responsible, this day and age in the United States of America, responsible media is the oxygen, really, for an educated, informed citizenry and for civil society. We discussed in the group, I speak for myself, not for the group, but I refer to the report and try to characterize it as accurately as I can, that the existing infrastructure is pretty fabulous, and that's Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, and the others, that more resources are exceptionally useful. I think this is a moment in history, much like Ronald Reagan's moment. I don't think anybody is going to look back 10 years from now and say, you know what, they just emphasized that democracy stuff too much. They kind of overdid it. I don't think so. I think that we run the risk of underdoing it at our expense. Rachel, we discussed in the group the idea of additional resources for additional congressionally funded enterprise that would be grant making to use and put to use all those fabulous networks and talented and motivated journalists around the world operating in their countries as the US funded entities already do, to support accountable government and pluralism and tolerance and rule of law. And the last thing I'd say is we talked about methods too, and how important it is to do even more to support and resource investigative journalism. It's so easy to say, it's very hard to do because it takes training, skill sets, it involves risk, sacrifice, provision of safety and security, but how valuable is that? And if you look at the report, if you look at point 3, recommendation 3, and recommendation 4, There's a confluence there. Understanding the link between anti-corruption efforts and democratization initiatives and free and independent media. And so let me just tell you one concrete example to bring it to life maybe a little bit. The Russian war against Ukraine, I think, focuses the mind in so many ways. But one is, think of what we're learning now, even more so through sanctions and oligarchs, and how oligarchs steal and store money abroad. We knew this before. I think there's a little more focus right now. Think of what Russian citizens, whether they like America or like NATO, well, what Russian citizens surely want to know about the stealing and storing of their wealth abroad. Case study. Is this 1/10, 1% maybe? You know the story of the one oligarch and the one piece of property and the one yacht named after his mom, okay? Dilbrook, do you know this story? And the yacht is a 512-foot vessel with a very large swimming pool, not one helicopter pad, but two, valued at between $600 and $750 million. That's one boat for pleasure. Occasionally, Russians want to know about this of all stripes. They also want to know that that one boat in Moscow would pay for about 7 state-of-the-art 500-bed hospitals to treat COVID patients. This is reporting that informs people about what governments do and don't do for them. I think that has powerful effect. We're doing it. We have done it. We could do it a lot more.
Thank you. Jeff hit on both the journalism point, but also the link with corruption quite well. Nicole, the technology point, any reflections on the way that the working group dealt with that set of not only challenges but also new opportunities in this space?
Absolutely. There was general consensus really that this is an area where we have a lot of opportunity to grow, in large part because technology is evolving every day, and we recognize that technology is not in and of itself a good or a bad, but it is certainly being used on both sides, both by authoritarians as well as democracy defenders. But we recognize that authoritarians are using it very, very effectively to extend their reach, to disrupt, to attack democratic infrastructure around the world, to repress and silence dissidents and activists around the world. And so there's a real deep need to equip the other side, to equip the defenders with technology that's really going to enable their work, right? And some of that is figuring out how to defend against authoritarians' attacks, whether that is on infrastructures that are elections or whatever, other part of the democratic infrastructure, but also really to provide democracy defenders with what they need to be able to communicate, to be able to protect against the surveillance, which is a daily part of their lives, and to be able to defend themselves against what we know is a technological onslaught on them. There's a huge opportunity, obviously, with the business community that has an interest in seeing more democracies and open societies around the world, for them to be investing in these technologies and figuring out how we make these technologies more available to democracy defenders around the world. We have an infrastructure that is getting a lot of assistance to these folks already, but what we need to ensure is that it's not just that assistance that's getting them by every day, but it's really higher level technology that's going to up their game to really fight this fight.
One of the things. Oh,
So just if I can add, so as the report was being written, Ukraine was playing out before our eyes, and this is one of those areas where I think we got outpaced. We couldn't keep up, and I think that technology is almost too broad a topic was worthy of its own report because of all the different aspects. So you've just heard what I think Nicole has described very well. But I would go back to what the Undersecretary pointed to. So you had Putin counting on his ability to wash everything out with his propaganda machine, and the administration, to its great credit, one step ahead in putting things out and really disrupting some of the false flag operations that they hope to do. So that's one very important aspect of it. But secondly, take a look at the use of TikTok in particular. So you have everyday citizens. This is not major investments in new technology. This is frugal, cheap, handheld technology. They were able to preempt. They were able to show the false operations that the Russians were doing and the brutality of what the Russians were doing in ways that I think had a profound impact, particularly on Ukrainians in the East. It changed a lot of things for them, and I think undermined what Putin tried to do. But the final piece to this that we should not underestimate, and that is that technology has created rising expectations and linkages to other parts of the world. I began my career in foreign policy as a teacher in Kenya in a little village where there was one wind-up telephone on a box. None of my students knew they were poor. None of my students knew that they weren't living in a democracy. They had no idea. All of a sudden, within a few years, they know. And they're demanding. And they want to know why so-and-so in Uganda's got something that they don't. And so don't underestimate what this linkage and rising awareness of everyday citizens does. It changes everything and drives unresponsive leaders nuts because they have to deal with that reality. So it's this very broad aspect to it, and then the individual tools. It is changing everything and almost too broad for us and evolving too quickly for us to even keep up with.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really appreciated about the working group's approach to this technology point in particular, which builds off of both Mark and Nicole's comments, is that there's a lot of talk, of course, about how authoritarians are leveraging new technologies to repress and surveil, and defending people against that is an important aspect of how we can and should use technology. But in a similar way that President Reagan, through the Westminster speech, kind of flipped the script and said, this isn't just about defending against the advance of communism. This isn't just about containing communism or authoritarianism. This enterprise is about advancing freedom and democracy in the world. I think technology was really the key theme in the report, and you see this in the recommendations where the working group leaned most into that sort of proactive, how do we leverage these new technologies to go on the offensive for freedom, for advancing, for empowering, and equipping these freedom fighters around the world with the tools that they need as well. Ken, final key theme of the report, if I can ask you to speak on the international cooperation piece in terms of the recommendations in that regard.
That there is this phenomenon of a democracy architecture ecosystem that I spoke briefly about that didn't exist 40 years ago. And I'm also go back to the President Reagan's speech and the establishment of the endowment. It was not based on projects and countries and matrices and outcomes and goals and all the language that the bureaucracy uses to advance democracy programs. It was all about relationships. And the president's speech was about relationships. And I think one of the unique attributes of the endowment from the early days to the party institutes, to labor, to business, is go forth and establish relationships. And when we began doing that, people were saying, where have you been all these years? These were political parties, these were labor unions, these were business groups, that we were joining something that existed already. And we saw ourselves as part of something larger than ourselves. The party institutes were American chapters of an international club of small d democratic parties. And so Howard French wrote a very penetrating piece recently about Africa and about the successive U.S. administrations that tend to look at Africa as a problem. He quotes one former Assistant Secretary of State saying, my job is to make sure that Africa doesn't get on the president's desk. We have to show our interest in these places. We have to show our interests in these other groups and organizations, whether it's ECOWAS or the African Union or the OAS, or I could go on and on about groups that are engaged in this, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. But we have to show our interest, and then we have to engage with them on a whole host of levels. And the notion of relationships, I think, goes to the core of this. I tell, Damon is sick of hearing me say this. David Brooks wrote a wonderful op-ed years ago about a youth program in New York City. And he asked a youth leader what programs turn around disaffected young people. And he said, that youth leader said, I haven't seen one program turn around one young person. It's relationships turn people around. And that network of relationships that has been forged and developed over the years has to be broadened even more and deepened. And everybody has to show an interest in this, government, non-government, and a variety of sectors.
I had a couple of points here. So on the positive side, I think many people don't appreciate the essential role that the Ned and Ned family play. So my friend Derek Mitchell, who like me was an ambassador, one of the problems that embassies have in making the case for democracy is they sometimes have to deliver unpleasant things to their host country leadership, and they sometimes get pressure from the main headquarters of the State Department not to do it because you're hurting relationships. The Ned doesn't have that problem. The Ned's constituency is democracy. And by building those relationships, the Ned can do things and deliver messages in a way that sometimes other parts of the government can't. And that's really, really important. Secondly, one bit of a sour note on the international cooperation. So what is a little concerning, and maybe this is part of the new charge, too many countries have become timid in defending democracy around the world. So when the Undersecretary mentioned that 93 countries had voted to kick Russia out of the Human Rights Council, 100 did not. They wouldn't have gotten the necessary number except 50 abstained. That's the best we could do. The largest democracy in the world isn't with us. The two largest democracies in Asia are not with us. They should be. So I think we also have to, all of us, make a call. Democracies need to stand up for democracies. It matters. It's important, because if they won't, who will? And so that's the one sort of sour note, that observation from what's happening around Ukraine. Less than 20% of the world's population lives in countries that are putting sanctions on Russia. So I think the Biden administration has done a very good job in rebuilding the transatlantic alliance and strengthening NATO. But let's not be under any illusions here. Most of the world is not standing up in the way that, quite frankly, it should, and we have work to do, all of us.
I want to take the last few minutes of our event today to hear from our audience. Tevi, Dr. Troy.
Thank you. Thanks for this interesting panel. If we want to turn around this slow decline of freedom, as the Freedom House study shows, we have to start somewhere. And I think that taking into account Ken's good point about Brent Scowcroft and it's not easy, what region would each of you identify as the place that's most likely to turn democratic in the years ahead if we put our minds to it? And then also, what area are you most worried about?
Well, first of all, I think part of the answer isn't for us to put our minds to things. I think it is, democracy doesn't come from the outside, it comes from within. We can walk with them on the journey and provide tools and enhancements. I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to Africa. Africa is the youngest continent. Young Africans have aspirations. Young Africans are being demanding. I think there's an enormous opportunity in the African continent. So that's what I would point to.
I would not pick one region. I would pick types of countries, because I think across every region you've got countries that are backsliding in ways which are tremendously problematic, and you've got other countries which are just fighting against all odds and making progress that, you know, most people wouldn't bet on. I think the two things that I would say that I would want to see us really double down on is, one, the younger generation, right? And tying the passion and the energy that they have to democracy and institutions, right? Because the idea of Brent Scowcroft, it's just, you're going to fail and it's going to be hard and it's going to take a long time, is not what a Twitter generation really likes to hear, right? Like, if it doesn't come fast, then it doesn't exist. But it is a passionate and an energized generation. Tie it to democracy, and I think you unleash a lot of potential. The second is, there are democracy movements around the world, and there are individual human rights defenders, democracy movements, and I think we need like a theory of change that's going to go across those, and to be able to figure out how we target assistance much more effectively to where different actors are in that process of transition, because it's not the same everywhere, but it's also not always different everywhere, right? And to some extent, we have to harness that theory of change to bring like transformational change in some countries, and I think that we'll see exponential gain from that.
I think the years after President Reagan's speech, where I think we were wrong was that the democratic progress was going to be more linear. We also found out that dissidents, opposition leaders, tended to be more democratic in opposition than they were in government. The Mandelas or the Havels were few and far between. Branislaw Goremek talked about democracy not going from triumph to triumph. And I think we learned a lesson. And I think if there is a mistake today, that we tend to cast the democracy promotion effort as supporting good people against bad people, supporting Democrats against autocrats, important as that is. But there are lots of places around the world who have made the initial transition. That it isn't good versus evil, it's good versus good, but how do you sustain the progress in these countries? And we tend to have a short memory. The United States and Americans want to see quarterly dividends, and if the quarterly dividend is good, they'll move on to something else. And countries are graduated way too early. And I think this is why I think the report made a reference to a democracy stimulus, that we need more resources and more attentions so we can help those countries that have made a commitment to democratic governance, but they've inherited, in a sense, all the bad from their non-democratic predecessors, poverty, disease, and corruption. Right. And the question is, how do you work with those countries? And they exist everywhere. And I think that it's wrong just to cast this in terms of autocracy and democracy. It's how do you sustain these countries? Because we've seen, Hugo Chavez once said famously, "I'm not the cause, I'm the result." He was the result of failed political institutions in Venezuela. Venezuela had plenty of civic organizations at the time. They were the teachers of democracy in the hemisphere. So how do you make sure that there aren't a lot of Venezuelas taking place around the world, and more attention has to be placed in places like Cote d'Ivoire and Mali and places like that, where you've seen tremendous backsliding over the years. So.
I want to close with a quote not from the Westminster speech, if I may, but it is from President Reagan. When he opened the Reagan Library, which this foundation and institute serves to fulfill and continue and promote his own legacy, he had a great quote in that speech about, as the mythology of communism melted from the heat of truth, right? As authoritarianism declined and the end of the Cold War neared, he said, our greatest enemy now may be complacency itself. And I hope that you'll all agree that this working group and this report serve to get beyond complacency and to say this mission is alive and well, this work remains important, there remains work to be done, and that this 21st century democracy stimulus will help us rise to the challenges and meet the opportunities of the 21st century. So thank you.
Rachel, can I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
You began by talking about families, and all families are on occasion dysfunctional. I will say that this family, this working group family, didn't suffer from dysfunction, and that had to do a lot with your leadership, with Roger's leadership, with the work of Thomas and Rana and others in the Reagan Institute. And I think the group and the individuals in the group relied on that leadership and that support, and I think it produced a good outcome.
Well, thank you for that.
Hear, hear.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you as well.